Masechet Sukkah, Daf 24, Kaf Dalid. And we have a few very important topics today. We're going to start off talking about, do we worry about far-fetched occurrences? And then we'll talk about writing a get on an animal. And finally, building a sukkah in a forest where you use the trees as walls. So this idea about something far-fetched. Last night, we were just talking about that there was a tornado warning that came to all of our phones, and it said, go down to the basement. So that was kind of worrying, but seemed very far-fetched. Like, really, a tornado's coming here, and it's going to, will be safe in the basement. So we debated about it, and we said, it's too far-fetched. We're not going down, and we just stayed where we are. So if you can't worry about every little far-fetched thing, and the Bavli here is gathering together three different cases of something far-fetched and comparing them. So it's really very interesting the way it conceptualizes this topic. So the way we got into it, just a little quick review of the things that we need to know, is from this Braita down here, where the Bimeir says you cannot use an animal as a wall of a sukkah. You can't use it for lechi, from avoy. You can't use it for corners. And you can't, remember this one, you cannot use an animal for a cover of a burial cave. I mean, you can put it there, but the point is it will not become tameh. Generally, that stone that you put on to cover the cave becomes tameh. An animal, a live animal, generally does not become tameh. And so it would be me'ir is saying that this animal, even if you put it standing at the front of the cave, will not become tameh. It's not considered a wall or partition covering that cave. Okay, that's going to come up again. And Rabbi Yosef HaGelili says also, you cannot write a get on an animal. This is also going to come up. So this is a central baraita. Now, back to the first case of using it for a sukkah. Why can't you use a live animal for a sukkah? So we saw the Bizarah said maybe it's going to run away. Abaye said maybe it will die. And if it dies, it falls to the floor, it won't be 10 tefachim high. So that's what he worried about. This seems like a bit of a far-fetched case, right? How often is it going to die right then in the middle of the meal? But that seems to be what he said. And then we asked a question on that. And I'll just bring up from the chart that we said you had here. So that was one case. Rabbi Meir says it's invalid because he worries about the far-fetched case of the animal dying. The second case was a husband that goes away. And then the wife is left, and he is a Kohen. She is not a Bat Kohen. So let's assume they don't have children. So can we assume that he's alive, and therefore she can continue eating terumah? Or do we have to worry, maybe he's dead? He goes away for a couple of months. Who knows what happened to him? Traveling was dangerous in those days. So over here, we have the Bimeir says, assume he's alive. Sorry, the Mishnah says we assume he's alive. There's a Braita of a similar case that say you have to assume he's dead and she cannot eat terumah. There's a contradiction between these two. So Abaye says that the first Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. Usually a Mishnah, Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. So, and the Braita is Rabbi Yehuda. And now we have a contradiction because the Abaye said that in the case of the animal, Rabbi Meir does worry about a far-fetched case, whereas in the case of the husband going away, Rabbi Meir is the one that doesn't worry about the far-fetched case. So we resolve this by switching it around. Maybe Abaye said the opposite. After all, the Mishnah and Baraita are not named. There's no names in it. And it's true. Usually we say Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but not always. It's not a foolproof rule. So by switching it around, now he has Rabbi Meir is the one that says that she has to stop eating terumah the second he walks out the door. Okay, so that resolved this case. But then we have a third case of a far-fetched situation. And this is where I have a lot of wine on Shabbat. I didn't take terumah maaser. So it's tebel. I'm not allowed to drink this wine, but I really want to enjoy Shabbat and use the wine. So here's a loophole that Rabbi Meir says you can do. I'm going to make a declaration now and say, I'm going to take terumah maaser after Shabbat. Whatever I separate after Shabbat will retroactively be separated from now. So right now, I have this big jug of wine in a wine, let's say it's in a wineskin, in an animal, in this pouch. And so I drink 50, 60, 70% of it. And then I'll leave at least 22% till after Shabbat. After Shabbat, then I say, oh, here's 2 lugim, that's for the Kohen. This other 10 I'll give to the Levi, and so I separate it after. Retroactively, I drank kosher wine. So the Meir says you can do that. The Yehuda says you can't do that. Why? Seems because he's worried about the far-fetched idea, the occurrence that the wineskin might break sometime in the afternoon of Shabbat, and then all the wine will spill. I won't be able to remove the Teruman Maaser after Shabbat, and then turns out I drank Tebel. So here we have Rabbi Yehuda worrying about the far-fetched idea, and Rabbi Meir says it's okay. And this here is now another contradiction with the lineup in Sukkah, where the Meir does worry about far-fetched ideas, and here the Meir does not worry about far-fetched ideas, and that is where we begin our discussion. So, Kashya de Rabbi Meir, de Rabbi Meir. So, right, this is on 24a, right on top. So we have a contradiction between the 2 statements of Rabbi Meir. On the one hand, he says that for a sukkah, we do worry about the far-fetched occurrence of the animal dying, and therefore you cannot use an animal. On the other hand, he doesn't worry about the far-fetched occurrence of the wineskin breaking open. And so he says, it's fine, you can do the retroactive loophole. Amar lecha Rabbi Meir, mita shechicha, b'kiyat hanod la shechicha. Efshad demasar le la shomer. He says, dying is common. I mean, all animals are eventually going to die, and it could die on. It could be on Sukkot. However, the bursting of a wineskin, that's not common. And after all, you can give it to a guard. Say, listen, here's your job. Just watch this thing. Make sure nobody bumps into it. Make sure it doesn't fall. It doesn't split open. So you can be very careful, and that the wineskin will not. So therefore, he worries about something that is a little bit less far-fetched, which is the dying of the animal. That yes, but he doesn't worry about the wineskin. Okay, good. So now we resolve the 2 statements of Rabbi Meir. Kashya de Rabbi Yehuda de Rabbi Yehuda. Now we also have to resolve this. Rabbi Yehuda regarding Sukkah says, don't worry about the animal dying. You can use an animal for a wall of a Sukkah, right? And it's a live animal, and he doesn't worry that it's going to die and slouch down. He says it's perfectly fine. So you see, he's not worried about far-fetched ideas. And yet, he disagrees with regarding the wineskin. He says, no, don't do the wineskin loophole. Maybe the wineskin will split open. So now he does worry about far-fetched ideas. So which one is it? Here's the answer. The Yehuda's reason for being stringent regarding the wineskin is different. Not because it might burst open on the afternoon of Shabbat, but rather because he doesn't like this whole retroactive clarification, right? You can't do that. You can't, if you're drinking it now, you violate now, tevel, just because you've separated it later and then retroactively it was. No, he doesn't buy this whole loophole. That's why he doesn't like it. Okay, is that true? Does he really not worry about it? Keep reading the Braita. We only quoted the beginning of the Braita, but it goes on and there's a conversation between them. The 3 rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir, it says you can't use the retroactive loophole. It says, Rabbi Meir, you say you can drink the wine now. Aren't you worried that it might split open, and then you won't be able to take to the Ma'aseh after, and it'll turn out that you are drinking tebel. So aren't you worried about that? When it breaks open, I'll worry about it. When the sky falls down, then honestly, no, I'm not worried about that. Doesn't happen. So good. That's the end of the conversation. Now, what do you see from the conversation? That Rabbi Yehuda, who's one of the 3 rabbis against Rabbi Meir, he does worry about the breaking open. So that's his problem. It's not a problem of bid'ah. That's not what he says. We have their conversation. We have a record of it. So we know that Rabbi Yehuda does, in fact, worry about far-fetched ideas. And so back to the contradiction. So we say no. Hatam Rabbi Yehuda de Kamal Rabbi Meir ledidi letli berera. No, you misunderstood the conversation. Sometimes people say things in an argument that they don't really mean. They just want to counter their point, but really they have a different perspective. But they want to be more convincing. And says even according to you, says listen, according to me, Rabbi Yehuda says I don't think that you could do this whole retroactive thing. But I know you disagree and think you can do berera. But even according to your logic, don't you worry that it will break open and you won't be able to do it at all? And to be Meir, you should be the one that worries, because in other cases you're the one that is always worried about these things, about far-fetched occurrences. Amar le Shabakan, Bimir says, no, I'm not worried about this one. This is way too far-fetched. And yeah, maybe I'll worry about other cases, but I'm not worried about this. Okay, good. So now we're able to resolve both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda for all of the three cases that we already mentioned. But now we're going to bring in a fourth case of something far-fetched. This is one that you know already from Masechet Yoma, all the way in the beginning. Hatanan, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af Isha Acheret Matkinin Lo Shema Tamut Ishto. The first Mishnah in Yoma says that the Kohen Gadol, we have a Sgan Kohen, just in case the Kohen dies or becomes Tameh. We can't. The show must go on. It's Yom Kippur, so we have a sub that that can come in and perform the rest. Rabbi Yehuda says we also have a wife in waiting. To take over. What if the Kohen Gadol's wife dies on Yom Kippur? It's no good, because it says, right, he has to atone for his household. That means he has to have a household. The Kohen Gadol has to be married, right? We saw such a big contrast to Christianity, where they can't be married. So this is Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim disagree with him. Only Rabbi Yehuda says we worry about this far-fetched occurrence that the wife might die. So ha'itmar Allah, amar Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua ma'ala asu bechapara. So the question was, Rabbi Yehuda, in all the cases we just saw, he's the one that's not worried about something far-fetched. He doesn't worry about the animal dying. And yet here, he worries that the wife is going to die. So the answer is that Rav Huna said that for when it comes to atonement on Yom Kippur, we go an extra mile. And usually we wouldn't be worried about such a far-fetched idea, but because atonement on Yom Kippur is so important, so this elevates it. And just the fact that you do this and people know about it, it brings such importance and significance to the day. Okay, good. So we resolved that too. But we're about to overturn this whole edifice that we just created. Ben leman damar shema tamut. Ben leman damar shema tibrach. Whether you follow Abaye, who says in the case of a live animal being used as a wall, no good because it might die. That's the Meir's reason. Or the Bizera, who said maybe it will run away. And that's why you can't use an animal. Basically, what you're saying is that on the Torah level, a live animal can be a good wall. And you're just saying, now we worry, but gezerah, maybe it will run away. I mean, if it doesn't run away and if it stays alive, yeah, it's good. But we have to make a gezerah because maybe it will happen and therefore don't use it at all. So basically, on the Torah level, it's a kosher sukkah. On the Rabbanan level, they're more stringent. So fine, the rabbis always do this, and they add stringencies to keep us safe from violation. Ela me'ata, but this explanation doesn't cover all the cases in that Baraita, because one of the cases in the Baraita was using an animal to cover a burial cave. And in that case, from a Torah level, you're saying that this is a good partition. Therefore, from a Torah level, that animal will be tameh, because anything that covers a burial cave is tameh. And now you're saying that the rabbis came and made a gezerah and says, no, don't use it because it might run away, it might die and not cover the entire burial opening. And therefore, it's now the animal is tahor. Now you're using it for leniency, right? The rabbis can add a gezerah to be more stringent, but not to make it more lenient than the Torah law. You can't have the Torah law says this animal is a mechitza and covers it, and therefore it's tameh. The rabbis say, oh, it might run away, so don't do that. Then it's tahor. What if it stayed there nicely and didn't die, right? Now you're saying the rabbis have the power to uproot. There are some cases like that, but they're pretty rare. So therefore, this whole line of reasoning doesn't make any sense. Right, this is another source similar to what another Mishnah similar to that baraita that we just read, that Rabbi Yehuda says an animal covering a burial cave is okay, is tameh, meaning it is a partition. Rabbi Meir says tahor, that it's not a partition at all. So it seems that Rabbi Meir's reason is more fundamental about the definition of a partition, and not because, oh, maybe it will run away. And therefore we reject this whole line of reasoning. It's not because the animal run away. The problem is not because the animal will die. Forget all that. We're going to have a new reason. So this is really amazing that we worked so hard on this. And this is, I think, a support for the theory I mentioned yesterday, that I think when Abaye says we worry that it might die, he really said that regarding the get case. We worried when a husband goes away for a few months. My grandfather used to go away for months and months at a time, right? And who knows, you could traveling by ship. There's really a lot of dangers. You have to worry that the person will die, might have died, and therefore don't eat terumah during that time. That's where Abaye said that. And the Talmud here is trying to make a whole edifice about, do we worry about far-fetched ideas, and brings 4 different cases and says, well, Abaye said that there. Would he say the same thing here? Right, about the animal, and the animal might die. And so then by saying that, we try to line everything up. The Bimeir always saying one thing and Yehuda, and we were able almost to resolve all the cases like this. But we got stuck at the burial cave, right? And the whole edifice broke down there. But still, we learned a lot about different far-fetched cases.
But there's like infinite amounts of variables.
Right.
So you can't.
Right, there are infinite amount of variables, and I think the sugya brought up a few of them so that you start thinking about them. It can't tell you every case that's ever going to come up in the world, right? But it gives you a demarcation line. Listen, someone going away for a few months, you never know what's going to happen. You put an animal right here, right now, it's not so much. And right, so you can weigh different cases in the future. So we learned important principles from this, but ultimately, that's not actually to be Meir's reason. So here we have a totally different answer, which sounds much more like the Peshat. Ela amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, kasabar Rabbi Meir, kol mechisa she'omedet beruach ena mechisa. Ikad amre amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, kasavar b'meir kol mechisa she'ena asuya b'idei adam ena mechisa. We have 2 different versions of his statement, but they're very similar. He says any partition that stands up only because of wind is not a mechitza. What he means is that the animal breathes. In order for the animal to stand up and be a partition, it has to be alive and breathing. And so this is not something, it's too dynamic, it's too active, right? It's kind of standing on its own strength and not just being there. Whereas a wall has to be something that is permanent, is just there, and doesn't think about having to be there. So that's one formulation, that if it depends on its breath, it's not good, which means a tree is okay because, well, trees do kind of breathe, right? But not in exactly the same way, not with lungs. They just, they do transfer gases, but a different way. So that is not dependent. It's not going anywhere. It's not thinking about it. It's not sentient. It's not dependent on its breath. That's one formulation. The other formulation is, and the mechitza that is not made by human hands is not a mechitza. So an animal is not made by human hands. So it has to be something. Now, it doesn't have to be actually made by humans. You can use a wall of a cliff, right? That's a natural occurrence. So that's okay. But the point is that you could make something like that. But an animal stands on its own. It's its own being, its own creation that we can't create. It's standing on its own 2 feet, 4 feet, and therefore it's now good. So this, I think, is a much simpler explanation, and it's on the deoraita level. It's about the very definition of a mechitza has to be something that's dead weight and will stay there, and whereas these things are alive and are on their own and therefore are not good. Now, my benayu, what's the difference between these 2 formulations? Is there any case that we could find that one formulation would say it's good and one not? Yes, ikar benayu de ukma benod tafuach. What if you use an inflated wineskin as one of the mechitzot? I think this is really nice how we just talked about wineskins being inflated and maybe leaking, and now it comes up here. So even though we rejected the whole edifice, but it's nice that we brought that in as a link to this one. This would certainly be a good mnemonic device, right? By linking once you get to the next. So according to the one that says it depends on breath or air, this depends on it being full of air. It's not breathing, it's not alive, but
Inanimate.
It is inanimate, but still it's full of air. And if it's dependent on it being full of air, right, just like an animal depends on its filling its lungs with oxygen so that it can be alive to stand up, then it's no good. Than that formulation. But the one that says it depends on being made by human hands, well, this is made by human hands. You took an animal skin, but you're the one that sewed it up and glued it and filled it with air, and therefore it would be okay. According to that definition. So there could be a difference between them. This would be interesting. Can you use a side of a sukkah an inflatable raft, or those bouncy houses, right? That's full of air. Well, that would depend on these two formulations. Okay, next. Amar mor mishum Rabbi Yosef Galili ameru. Right, so that we concluded that discussion, and basically, yes, you can use an animal for the animal. You cannot use an animal for a wall if it's alive, according to the Bimeir, and the reason is because you can't use things that are standing on their own. Okay, so with that conclusion, we go to the next item in that Braita. Rabbi Yosef Galili says, you cannot use, if you want to divorce your wife and you don't have any parchment around, you can't just take a little goat and then write on the goat, right, the whole language of the get, and give her the goat and say, here is your get. You cannot do that according to Rabbi Yosef Galili. Why not? What's wrong with it? So now we're going to do some extra midrash. The Tanya Sefer. Pasuk says when a man wants to divorce his wife, v'chatab la sefer kiritut. He has to write for her sefer. The word sefer means a scroll. It doesn't mean book in the times of the Torah. Books were not invented. Right. The idea of cutting something up and binding them on one edge was not yet in use until Roman times. And even in Roman times, the Jewish community did not adopt this until medieval times, like the Aleppo Codex was one of the was a book, but before that they didn't use books. So sefer means a scroll. So here it means something that is like a scroll, something written on parchment. So it has to be sefer, parchment. En li ela sefer. Minayin l'rabot kol davar. Hold on, is that true? You can only write a get on parchment? What about any other material? Talmud Omar v'chatab la mikol makom. So pasuk says two things. It says v'chatab la means anything you could write on. So if you want to write on papyrus and paper, or a piece of wood, piece of clay, they used to write things on clay. V'chatab la, all those are good. So now we have these two phrases. Imken ma Talmud Omar sefer. If you already have v'chatab la, which means you can write it on anything, then why do you have sefer? That means only on parchment, like a scroll. So to teach you a compromise between the two. Just like a parchment is not alive and is not food, so too you can write a get on anything you want as long as it's not alive and it's not food. You can't take a piece of lettuce and write it on the lettuce or on a gourd, and also not on a live animal. So there you go. That's the two things. And that's the compromise. But anything else that you can write on, you can use. So that's the Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's opinion. Now, Rabbanan disagree with them, and they say, yeah, it's fine. You can use it. You can write it on a live animal. So how will they explain these words? Listen, if the pasuk says v'katav besefer kiritut, you have to write it in a scroll, then I would agree with you. That has to be written on a scroll, on parchment, and not on a live animal. Hashtag dechtiv sefer, but it doesn't have a bet. It just says sefer kiritut. The word sefer comes from retelling, right? Telling a story. Interesting. Sefer also means to count. All right. I mean, in English, you have to count and to recount. Is to tell a story. So they are similar. Maybe because when you tell a story, you kind of memorize the order of the story, kind of like when you're counting numbers. So anyway, the point is that the point is not being about written in a scroll, but rather you have to send the message in any way that you want. Just as long as the words are sent, that's all that's needed. Therefore, even on a live animal is okay. All right, but Rabbanan, so now once Rabbanan says you can write on anything, Now, what do you need v'chatab, that's being written? Because the Rabbi Yosef Galili learned from v'chatab that you can write it on all kinds of materials. But he already knows you can write it on all kinds of materials. So what does chatab add? For Rabbanan, hu mibaylehu b'chtiba mitkareshet ve'na mitkareshet bekesef. Sakadata chamina ho'il ve'itekash yisiya lahvaya mahavaya bekesef afisa bekesef ka mashma lan. Oh, you know what? The rabbis need that to teach you another law, a very important law, that you have to get divorced only in writing. It has to be a divorce paper and not with money. You might have thought, since kiddushin is done with money, kiddushin is also can be done with a shtar. We don't usually do that, but you could write hared mikudeshet li in a document and give it to her instead of a coin, and that would be fine. But kiddushin can also be done with a coin. That's what we usually do today. You give a ring or a coin, and you say, "Here, you are mikudeshet with this money." So you might think, just like you enter a marriage that way, so too you would leave a marriage in the same way. Kind of in that way, it would be kind of like acquiring a slave. You acquire a slave by paying for it, and then if the slave gives back, pays back his value, then he can leave. And so you might think of it all as a monetary transaction. If she wants to leave, she gives the ring back. That's okay. I'm on my way out. But so therefore, the chatav comes to teach us, no, you cannot do that. It's not a monetary transaction. He has to write it in a bill of divorce and say, right, you are no longer my wife. This is actually very important because some people think that when they're getting married, they're acquiring their life like a barter, like they're buying their value, which is not. It's a symbolic acquisition. That's why it can just be even peruta. And you can prove from here also that you can't leave the same way that you came in. Okay, so that's how Rabbanan explained the word vechatab. Now, where does Rabbi Yosef Galili? Doesn't he agree that you have to write a bill of divorce and you can't get divorced with money? He agrees with that, but where is he going to learn it from? He already used the word bechatab to teach me that I can use other writing materials. So sefer kiritut nafkale. He's going to learn it from the fact that we juxtapose not just any sefer, but sefer kiritut. That the divorce, the severance, has to be written in a sefer, written on a document. So you have to nafkale sefer korta and the korta. Only something written can cause the severance and not anything else, because that's how he learns it. Now, how about Rabbanan? What are they going to learn from the word kiritut and this juxtaposition with sefer? Are they going to learn something else from that? That you always have to have something that will be a final severance. Has to be the divorce has to be final. There can't be any strings attached. Here's an example. If a person gives a get and says, here, you are divorced on condition that you never drink wine or that you never go to your parents' house forever. I guess he doesn't like his in-laws very much, right? And so this is the problem, because this condition is forever. If at some point in 30 years from now, she should drink a sip of wine, then retroactively, she is no longer divorced. So he always has a hold on her. And that is not okay, because it's not a final severance. En zekiritut. However, what he can do is say, listen, you are divorced from now as long as you don't drink wine for the next 30 days. That's okay, because it has an end point. All right. And after 30 days, then she's totally free. No matter what she does, there's no condition on it. So that's actually a very important idea, that the husband is not allowed to have any hold, any strings attached to her in order for it to be a divorce, because that's the definition of divorce. Good. So that's what the rabbis learn from Sefer Kiritut. It has to be an absolute break. Now, Rabbi Yosef Galili, where is he going to learn that? He can learn it from the fact that the Torah doesn't use just karet, a short word, but from a long word, kiritut. Right? It could have said sefer karet. So from the length of the word, that's what they learn that from. And the rabbis, they disagree and they say, no, karet, kiritut is the same word. I'm not going to learn from the extra 2 letters, the 3 letters that of this word, the way it's spelt, it all means the same thing. And so that's where they come to a conclusion. So basically, they agree on all the other halachot, but they do disagree on whether you're allowed to use a live animal or not. Rabbi Yosef Galili says, no, you cannot use a live animal. And the rabbis say you can. And so it's based on this derivation. It's not similar to the other things on the list. Everything else on the list was about being a partition, right? And so this has its own derivation. Okay, and now we get to the last topic, which is also very important. Back to the canvas sukkahs that we were talking about yesterday. Here the case is how says sukkato ben ha'ilanot ve'ilanot tefanot la keshera. If you make your sukkah among the trees, like in this case. So here you have, I make a sukkah and I use the trees as walls. We'll talk about whether you're using the trunks or even the leaves of it. In this picture, you see they put the sechach on poles. So the sechach is not being held up by the trees, but rather on their own, you're only using the trees as poles. Other mefarshim say, no, maybe some other case where you're actually leaning it on the sechach on the trees. Okay, either way are both interesting cases. This is not the same as what we had before when you put the sukkah up in the tree and you have to climb up and rest on the tree. That was no good if most of the walls were supported by the trees. But here it's not that it's being supported by, you're not being supported by, it's just they're using them as walls. So let's see what we say. This is okay. You can use trees as walls. Now let's analyze this. Amar Ravacha bar Yaakov. Any wall that cannot stand in a regular daily wind is not considered a partition. This is similar to a formulation we had yesterday with the boat, but there it was a little different. There it said any sukkah that cannot withstand a regular wind is not a sukkah. That was talking about the entire structure. This is talking about the wall in itself. So actually this statement is more relevant to the case of a canvas wall that can move a lot. It's not considered a wall. So that's what he said. Now, this statement is going to be our main focus, and we're going to challenge Ravacha from 4 sources. The first source is the Mishnah that we just read. Tenan. Says you can use trees as walls, but trees move, they wave, and they move in the wind. So what do you mean? How can you use it if they're going to move? No, we're talking about the trunk of the tree. That's hard and is not going to move. Okay, but what about its foliage? That's also there and part of the tree. And on top there, you might be using the foliage, and that for sure moves. No, we're talking about a case where I tied the leaves with palm leaves and laurel leaves, and I reinforced it so that it won't move. So only in that case can you use leaves, only if you make sure that they won't move. All right, it's a little bit maybe far-fetched to assume that that's the case in the Mishnah, but yeah, no, it can't move. You have to use a solid tree and a solid part of the tree, and if not, reinforce it. Hold on, if you reinforced it, then what's the chidush? Obviously, this would be good. Why would anyone even think that using trees as walls would be a problem? I might have thought maybe I should make a gezerah. If we allow you to use the trees as walls, maybe you'll come to use the trees for other things, and you'll start hanging things on the trees, climbing up the trees, because you say, look, we're allowed to use the trees for the wall. You might think you're allowed to use it for other things, and that's not true. You're not allowed to use it for anything else. And therefore, the Mishnah comes to teach you that don't make that leap, don't make that gezerah. You're allowed to use the trees, and we're not worried that people are going to come to use the trees for other purposes. So that's answer. That's number 1. Okay, challenge number 2 to Ravacha. Tashema. Hayasham ilan o gader o mechisat kanim nidon mishum diumad. So we have a baraita that says, if you remember the well here, right? We have a well in the middle of the Shut HaRabim, and the rabbis make a leniency. So you don't have to have a full enclosure, just have 4 corners. So a corner usually diumad, like 2, amud, 2 walls. We have an amah this way and amah that way. And if you have 4 of these, it's okay. This baraita comes and adds a chidush. Then not only do you need if it's a shape like an L, let's say just a block, right? But the block has within it, an amah by an amah, but it's not the shape of an L. That's okay too, even though the shape is better because it's clear that this is you're making a enclosure, but it can be like this also. You know what? It can also be a tree. Even if the tree is, as long as the tree is an amah by an amah, so if you would cut into it, you could make an L shape. You can use a tree, even though it's not as clear a sign that this is an enclosure. You know what else you could use? Reeds. that are a little bit apart. That's okay, because you can say lavud. As long as the reeds are standing up and they're a little bit apart, you can use that. So here's our question. Reeds are bendable, right? And aren't they going to bend in the wind? And yet you can use it. So this is a challenge to Rav Acha. Rav Acha says you're not allowed to use anything that can move in the wind. And yet here we said, regarding laws of Shabbat, regarding Eruvin, that you can use reeds as one of these corner brackets. Answer is that's only allowed if you reinforce those reeds with hard palm leaves and laurel leaves so that they will not move in the wind. All right. So he saved himself again. We're going to see the same answer is going to be used for everything, every case. Now the third case, Tashema ilane mesech ala aretz. This case, we have a tree that maybe it's like a weeping willow or other tree that goes down, right? There are actually some trees, so I live in Florida, where the branches go all the way down into the ground and create new trees, reroot. What are they called? Banyan trees. Amazing. Okay, this one is not that. It doesn't go all the way to the ground. If it did, it would also be fine. But even if it didn't, as long as it's less than 3 tefachim from the ground, we say lavud. So as long as the foliage is less than 3 handbreadths from the ground, you're allowed to carry under here. So on Shabbat, if you have any structure that's at least 10 tefachim high and at least 4 tefachim wide, and it has walls, you're allowed, that's a reshut hayachid, and you're allowed to carry in there on Shabbat. And this tree fulfills all of those requirements. And this is a question to Rav Acha, right? What do you mean? The foliage is going to move, right? When it's going to go back and forth. Oh, that case also is when you tied it, you tied the leaves with reeds, with palm leaves, so that they wouldn't move. Okay. Wait, not so fast. If so, we should be allowed to carry in the entire length of the tree. This is going to need a little background, which we'll fill in now. Alama amar Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua en metaltilin bo ela bet sa'atayim. But it was said about this that you can only carry up to 2 bet se'ah, 5,000 square amot. So here's the law on Shabbat. If you have a reshut hayachid, which is made for residence, then you can carry in it as big as it is. Even if you go to a giant hotel convention center, right? It's made for living in, it's covered and has walls. You can carry in the entire thing on Shabbat, even if it's very, very big. Okay, now if you have an outdoor space, a space that's made for outdoors, like a huge courtyard, and generally, if it doesn't have a roof, it's not a residence. So if you have a huge courtyard or garden, then the rabbis make a limitation, and you can only carry in it if it's less than 2 bet se'ah, 5,000 square amot. That was the size of the Mishkan enclosure, and that's where we learn it from. So that there is a limitation. So here's our question: if this thing, that this tree here, that you is high and comes down to the ground, and you fastened it with ties so that it wouldn't move, then it's already a reshut hayachid. It's like a residence, and therefore you should be allowed to carry in it even as long as you want. Now, it's not likely that one single tree will be over 100 feet wide. I don't know if there are big trees like that, but let's say whole forests, right? Many trees. Let's say it gives full coverage, and at the end, it comes down and has walls, so there's still a limitation. And the question is why? Since you have such a nice roof, and you made such nice, strong walls, isn't this basically like a reshut hayachid? And therefore, you should be able to carry as much as you want and not have the problem, a limitation of it being like a garden, which a garden doesn't have, is not made in that way. So we answer mishum dahave dira shetashmisheha le'avir v'chol dira shetemer le'avir emetatem bo ela satayim. No, because even though you're right, it's enclosed and has walls and all that, you don't live under a tree. It's a covering that's made for the outdoors. It would be like a little hut for a guard, right? He's only there to watch what happens outdoors, or maybe like a gazebo that someone has in front of their pool, right? They don't live in the gazebo. It's only there while you're at the pool to go get a drink or to get some shade. These things are made for outdoors, even though they are covered and are indoors. And therefore, those items also have the limitation that you can now only carry in it up to 2 betse'ah and not the entire thing. And that would explain this. Last challenge. תשמע שבת בתל שהוא גבוה 10 והוא מ400 עד בית סעתיים וכן בנקע שהוא עמוק 10 והוא מ400 עד בית סעתיים וכן כמה כסורה ושיבולות מקיפות אותה מהלך את כולה וחוצה לה 2,000 אמה. So here we have cases. Let's see if we have pictures of this. No. So where you have, if you are spending Shabbat on a tel, on a mound, and the mound is 10 tefachim above the rest of the ground, and it's at least 4 amot. It's 10 tefachim above the ground, and it's between 4 amot wide up to Bet Satayim. You can carry within that whole thing because it's considered Shuta Yachid, even though it doesn't have walls. But it's raised, so the raised part is itself a wall. The wall is going to go down under. And so that's an outdoor space, like a courtyard, and you can carry up to 2 betse'ah. Also, nekashu amok asara, this would be like a cavity. Let's think of a swimming pool where you have, it goes underground, but the sides of the swimming pool would be walls, and you have the bottom. You can carry, if you find yourself in a swimming pool on Shabbat, that's called, it's built as that's an enclosure, but it's not made for residence. So again, there you can carry in it from anywhere between 4 amot up till the maximum of 2 betzatayim, because it's not a residence, it's like a courtyard. And here's the last one is important for us. If you're in a grain field and the grain field is an opening in the grain field, so that you have walls all around that would be like the grain, and you're in the middle. And so you have the walls all around. So it's the same thing. It's like an enclosure. The grain itself can be an enclosure. I actually have a picture that I can use for this. If you give me 1 second. Yeah, here it is. Okay, now I am actually in this grain field, right? So if you're in this opening in the grain field, so you see that these grain could be walls. And yes, they count as walls, and this would therefore act as an enclosure like a chatzir, and I can carry in this area up to 2 betse'ah. So here is another challenge, that these things are wavy, they're going to move around, and yet this Baraita considers them to be good partitions. Isn't this a challenge to Ravacha, who says any movable partitions are no good? Even though they come and go. And the answer is, that's also talking about a case where I used hard palm leaves and laurel leaves to tie them and to strengthen them so that they would not move a lot. So the bottom line is, although we have all these four Tanaitic sources that seem to contradict the Ravacha and seem to say that reeds and wavy things are totally okay, nevertheless, the Gemara again and again keeps pushing them, limiting them, and we end up with Ravacha, and that is the halacha l'maaseh. You cannot use a wall that is movable, and therefore, best to get either hard walls or very tight. If it's going to be canvas, it should be very tight that it won't move, or the best thing is to use the lavud straps that are all sold together with the canvas sukkahs today. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen ve'amen.